in this passage of Scripture we've been studying in Mark chapter 8, we encounter a group of people from verse 11 through verse 13 that weren't a part of the original miracle. No doubt they heard about it as these multitudes of people come to a place called Dalmanutha, something like that. Anybody got the right pronunciation of that? That's close enough. If I wouldn't have said anything, you would have thought that was the right pronunciation, but it's not. Dalmanutha, that's it, Dalmanutha. Is that what I said the first time? All right. It's going to be a long sermon, I can tell that. All these people coming in, these probably 12,000 people that were a part of that miracle of feeding of the 4,000 men. This group hears about it, but they weren't there. They didn't see the miracle. And they want a miracle of their own. They're called Pharisees, and they go after Jesus. And it says there in verses 11 through 13, the first thing they do is they question Jesus. And the Greek word there in verse 11 for question is the word suzatsu, and it can be interpreted one of two different ways. It could be to question to bring out quality, or it can question to bring out argument. And when the Pharisees begin to question Jesus about this miracle that they missed, they're using the word to argue, to dispute, and to cause friction. Sometimes that's the way we treat God, especially when He's not doing what we want Him to do. When we want Him to do it, we begin to question Him, not for the purpose of bringing out quality, but for the purpose of disputing and arguing. Do you remember when Jesus went to Eve in the garden? Do you remember the first thing He said to her when He was trying to get them to fall into temptation and sin? Did he do this frontal attack and say, it's just a bunch of hooey, you eat this fruit and you won't die, and all of that's just a bunch of nonsense, go ahead and take it. You know what He does? He goes to her and He asks her a question. Do you remember that? And He says to Eve, did God really say? Are you sure? Did He really say that? When He asks that question, do you realize the last thing that boy wants is the answer? Because he's not in a search for truth. He's in a search to argue and dispel. Sometimes that's the way we treat God when He doesn't jump through the hoops the way we want Him to, and we don't have a blue piece of paper on the cross. Several years ago, I was invited to do a revival for a friend of mine. He was in seminary with me. We were prayer partners, and actually we prayed for 3 years. We prayed for you, even though we didn't know you, we didn't know your name. We were praying for you for 3 years, and we were praying for his future congregation. So I was kind of excited going up to Wisconsin, just a small town outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I was going to look at the names and the faces of the people I had been praying for that I didn't know. And one of the neatest moments of opportunity to pour into some of David's people was a prayer breakfast for men. He had about 20 men, and they were coming over to his house around 7 o'clock around a fire in the fireplace. And it was nice and cozy, and I had a message that I was excited to share with them. And as they gathered around, David got a phone call, and he had to step out of the room. As soon as he stepped out of the room, this guy named Pete raises his hand, and he says, hey, Pastor, can I ask you a question? Well, I got really into that because I'd been a student for 3 years. I was the one asking the questions. It's kind of neat for someone to ask me a question. I kind of got an ego trip on that. Oh, sure, you bet. How can my seminary-trained mind enlighten your poor, darkened layman's soul, you know? And he asked me a question, a doctrinal question. You know, there's two places you never go and ask a question because it's never to get a legitimate answer, is to argue. One is doctrine and the other is politics. Thank you, Andy. And I really thought he was genuine. He asked me a question about eternal security. And you know, I thought it was a legitimate question, wanting to search for some answers. So I gave him the pat answer that somebody stuffed down my throat in seminary, thinking that was just going to really enlighten him. First word out of his mouth after I gave the answer was, yeah, but. As soon as he said that, I knew I was in trouble, and I just got played. And he gave me the pat answer that somebody stuffed down his throat when he was in Sunday school somewhere. And I got a couple of buttons that I have to guard, and one of them's, debating in theology, and that button got pushed. And I stepped up to the line. And he stepped up to the line. And then a couple of other fellows stepped up to the line. Pretty soon everybody stepped up to the line. Everybody was talking and nobody was listening. And about that time, Dave walks back into the room. He looks at me and I said, I don't know how we got here. We were all kissy-poo, huggy-poo, and all of a sudden we're at each other's throat on a doctrinal debate. When that guy asked me that question, the last thing in the world he wanted was the truth. That boy asked that question for one reason. He wanted to argue. And he played me like the piano that was in the corner of the room. Sometimes we treat God that way. Are you with me this morning? Well, I don't have a blue card up on the cross. What's up with that? The second thing these guys who weren't a part of the original miracle do in verse 11 and verse 12, it says that they tested him. The Greek word for test is piezo, and it can either be test to bring out quality or it could be test to destroy. And they were testing him to destroy him because they weren't able to get the miracle they wanted. When they weren't a part of the original miracle, they want their own miracle. Isn't it kind of weird? Said, well, we need a test. We need a sign that you are who you say you are. Well, he just fed 12,000 people. And a couple chapters before that, he fed 16,000 people. And sandwiched in between, he threw out a couple of demons out of a possessed fella. And he walked on water. Just how many signs are we talking about here? I mean, how many miracles do you have to do? How many hoops do you have to jump through? All I want's a blue card on the cross. I remember the fella that was looking for the perfect woman? Remember that guy? He had his tests of what the perfect woman would look like. Had to be so tall and such a hair color and such blue eyes, and had to have such and such intelligence and a decent job and not so many kids and just had his test, and every woman that he met and dated, he would put through the test, and he left a long string of broken hearts. And a fellow comes along and he looks at him and he's all discouraged and dismayed, and he says, I guess you haven't found her. And he said, well, I found her yesterday. She was exact height, exact hair color, and exact education, had a great job, no kids. And he said, well, then why are you down the dumps? And if you remember, it says, because she was looking for the perfect guy. Remember that? Trying to get everybody to jump through his hoops. Sometimes we do that to God. Hey, man, jump through my hoops. I want a blue card on the cross. Remember the two taxidermists, the guys that stuff, deer and bear when you kill them, and so you mount them in your office or on your wall. They're on a lunch break and they're heading to the restaurant, and they pass a barber shop, and in the barber shop window is an owl that's been mounted in the window, and so they stop to critique it. Remember that? And one guy turns to the other and says, boy, that's a terrible job. They haven't mounted that owl good at all. And the other guy says, yeah, look at his eyes. It's too close together. And the other guy says, yeah, and look at the wings. It's disproportionate to the rest of his body. And look at those feathers. Man, what a lousy job he did on those feathers. And they're just shooting back and forth. Look at those feet, man. That's a terrible job. About that time, the owl looks at him and winks. And they go on to the restaurant. Sometimes we do that to God. Pass my tests because I don't have a blue sheet on the cross. Remember the cleaning woman, Mrs. Washington, who was cleaning the downtown highfalutin church? got a new job. And she decided to show up one Sunday to check it out. Man, she really liked it. The singing was explicit and the preaching was halfway decent. And she decided she wanted to make that church her church and join and become a member. Well, the pastor had a problem because everybody who attended that church was highfalutin and high society and, you know, multimillionaire, all kind of stuff. She didn't quite fit in. And to think that she would be sitting beside some highfalutin gal with a couple $1,000 hat on her head, and just didn't see how that could happen. So he tried to put her off and tried to put her off. Every time she come wanting to know how she could become a member, he would try to put her off and said, well, you need to read this book, and you need to read this book, you need to pass that test, you need to have this kind of ministry. And she would jump through every hoop, every hoop, every hoop. Finally, he ran out of hoops. Mrs. Washington came up one more time and says, am I ready now? Can I become a member of this church? And in exasperation, he said, Mrs. Washington, why don't you just go home and have a talk with Jesus? Tell me what he says. He says, okay, Pastor, that's what I'll do. Next day, he doesn't see her. Day after that, he doesn't see her. And those days go into weeks, and weeks go into months, and he starts feeling a little guilty about how he's handled Mrs. Washington. And all of a sudden, he runs into her. She's washing the floor, scrubbing the floor. And so he goes over to her and says, Mrs. Washington, I haven't seen you for a while. Did you ever have that talk with Jesus? And she says, yes, Pastor, I did. I had a long talk with him. And he said, well, what did he say? And she kind of whisked back a string of hair with a handful of suds. And she says, well, Pastor, he told me not to get discouraged and quit because he's been trying to get in your church for the last 25 years. Sometimes that's how we treat Jesus, because we don't have a blue card on the cross. Last thing that these Pharisees do, because they didn't get the miracle they wanted when they wanted it, they missed out on the first. The last thing is that they dismissed Jesus, or in fact it says Jesus dismissed them, because he gets in the boat and he sails away. Never got their miracle. Because they're so busy questioning him and they're so busy testing him that they miss him. I wonder how many times we've missed Jesus. Because we had it in mind. This is what I need Jesus to do. This is when I need him to do it. This is why I need him to do it. I need to set my sail and then pray that the Lord sends his wind so he can send my boat the direction I want to go and I can get to where I want to be. And sometimes I think we miss him. Seems to me that people that seem to catch Jesus and experience those miracles that we want so badly are the ones, instead of setting their sail and asking Jesus to fill it with his wind, instead, they figure out where the wind is blowing. And they set their sail to that wind. And trust him to take them where he wants them to go. It's a terrible thing to miss Jesus. When I was a kid preacher, I was in seminary. I had actually, no kidding, I had a couple classes I actually enjoyed. They weren't all Greek. And one of them that I enjoyed was history. I love history. I love church history. And one of the best church historians in the nation happened to be my teacher. His name was Dr. Kenneth Kinghorn. And he was teaching us about some of the history of the church in the United States. And he was teaching us about the two great awakenings. Most of you, or if you've been in church at all, you know that in the history of our country, there were two times when there was this great revival and just swept across the nation. And they called it the First Great Awakening in the 1740s and the 1750s with George Whitefield and Francis Asbury and John Wesley and Jonathan Edwards. And in that tremendous outbreak of God's Spirit, Whitefield preached to 25,000 people in Boston Commons. And when they got under conviction, it says they fell, they dropped on the ground like dead men. It said that the Spirit of God was so thick the presence of God was so thick over the colonies that when the ships would come across from Europe, when they get within 100 miles of the coastline, the sailors would fall under conviction and they'd get saved before the ship would even get to port. And I'd hear about that and I'd listen to that and I'd say, man, I want to be a part of that. I wish I could have lived in the 1740s, 1750s, experienced that great outpouring. Then he talked about the Second Great Awakening. It was in the 1800s, 1801, 1802, and some of the brush arbors that were the forerunners of the great prayer meetings. In fact, there was a brush arbor in 1801 in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, that had 22,000 people. The whole population of the state was only 77,000, a third of the entire state. The largest city was Lexington. They only had 2,000 people. And I'd read about that and my heart would burn. And they would have these preaching marathons, and they would have these people camped in the middle of big fields, and on the outskirts of the field there would be 5, 6, sometimes 12 preachers in different stations preaching all at the same time into this field of 22,000 people. It would go on for weeks. I would read about it and say, man, I wish I could have been a part of that. I wish I could have experienced a brush arbor. I mean, God, good night, give me a break. So imagine how shocked I was when in one of his lectures, I'm just I'm hanging on every word this guy says. And right in the middle of the lecture, you know what this guy says? You know what he lays on us? He says that the history books of the future, the history books that are written 100 years from now, and this is in the 1980s, will record that in the 1960s and 70s and early 80s, America experienced its third Great Awakening. I stopped in mid-sentence. I was writing, I went, what did I just hear? Say, what? Third Great Awakening? What Great Awakening? I haven't seen any Great Awakening. In my denomination, all the churches are dead, stagnant, and stale. Nobody gets saved for a whole year. What Third Great Awakening? Are you kidding me? And then he described it. He went into more detail, and you know what he said? He said this Third Great Awakening was primarily manifested, hold on to your seat now, in the charismatic movement of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I remember my first thought. It was, oh, that. Because we weren't too big on the charismatic movement in those days. A lot of our churches got split over the immaturity of charismatics who thought everybody had to speak in tongues to get spirit-filled. That didn't go down too good for some of our old-timers who have been walking with the Lord for about 40 years. And split our churches, so we just, that's got to be of the devil, that's got to be of the devil. And we threw it out. And we threw out everything that even had anything to do with charismatic, like lively worship and healing and miracles and revelations. And you know what we did? We threw the baby out with the wash. Along with all that stuff that we threw out because we didn't want to be associated with charismatic, we threw the Holy Spirit out. And we died. And something dawned on me that scared me half to death. It began to dawn on me that God was doing a new thing. And he did it without me. Now some of you thinking, Pastor John, you saying we all got to speak in tongues? No. I don't speak in tongues. Got some major problem with somebody who would say you're not spirit-filled if you don't speak in tongues. Got a pretty big problem with that. But I do believe in the Holy Spirit. And when he moves, bro, I want to be there. I don't want him to do it in spite of me. I want him to do it with me. I don't want to set my sail and say, okay, God, fill it with your wind. Just tell me where the wind is blowing. Where is God moving? And I'll set my sail to that wind. And I will trust him to take me where he wants me to go. Just don't do something new and do it without me. Are you with me this morning? Guys, God is doing it. God is doing a new thing. Maybe your card isn't up here. Don't think that he doesn't love you. Don't think that you don't count. If everybody could do a miracle at the snap of their finger, it wouldn't be a miracle anymore, would it? We don't understand everything about miracles. But I know my God still does them. And he invites us to come. And he invites us to ask. He invites us to seek him.